When is democracy? Yes, I know it's a stupid title. In this episode, we'll be examining the origins of representative democracy, a historical analysis on a kindergarten level because, well, that's what happens when you have a comedian with a poor grasp of everything in general, coupled with a penchant for Wikipedia. In 754 BCE, Sparta formed a parliament of sorts with representatives chosen from the population, which were called ephors. Of the handful of historically documented ephors, most were wealthy and/or high caste. Sound familiar? There were poor ephors, and, as Aristotle, that guy who is famous for being famous, wrote,
Help me, I'm in ancient Greece and there's no Netflix.
He wrote,
Its 5 members are chosen from among all the people, with the result that very often men who are not at all well off find themselves holding this office, and their lack of means makes them open to bribery.
Apparently, there was no word for lobbying in ancient Greece. By the 7th century BCE, there was the Ecclesia, the Spartan assembly, where the proletariat could vote on the issues of the day by making noise. That's right, the Spartans invented the clapometer. That's their sole contribution to history other than the 300 movie. Kings Polydorus and Theopompus, I swear I'm not making these names up, dear viewer, gave themselves veto power to, and I quote, set aside any crooked decision of the people. Make a note of that one, dear viewer, because we'll be seeing more of that attitude down the long corridors of the ages that we'll get through in about 10 minutes. The next major development in representative democracy was in 930 CE in Iceland with what they called the Althing, which was the Gemete of the Icelandic parliament. It should be noted that the representatives, chieftains and the like, were not elected to office. In 1529 CE, Henry VIII, who, if you'll recall, was a colonialist as far as Ireland was concerned, formed the Reformation Parliament, which wasn't a reformation in the sense he was getting the band back together, Henry and the Femicides. No, he just formed a parliament of unelected representatives, but not to weaken his monarchist powers, but to further enhance them, especially against the Catholic Church, from whom he wanted a divorce. Staying in England, we move along to the Triennial Act of 1694, which put into law the mechanism for the world's first general election. Hey, it's only been 2,500 years since the formation of the first parliament. Things take a little while, you know. Incremental changes, folks. This is when the first two-party system was established, the Whigs and the Tories. The Tories being the Conservative Party. Peter Bottomley was there, he knows all about it. Now then, let's get into the meat and potatoes of why representative democracy has never served the common folk. That's you, isn't it? The common person doing common things on the common. Who could vote in this election? Landowners and the gentry. The very people who have no interest in your interests. By the time the 1780 election rolled around, less than 3% of the population voted, and not a one of them was a woman. By 1884, the Third Reform Act, the belated sequel to the 1867 Second Reform Act, sought to increase the votes of the population without giving them any meaningful power. For instance, the big cities, Birmingham and Leeds, had large populations but no members of parliament, whereas Dunwich had 32 people living in it and had 2 members of parliament. They referred to these latter areas as rotten boroughs because the word gerrymandering didn't exist yet. Did it, America? No. On the 10th of July 1804, at approximately 4:23 p.m., Alexander Hamilton, one of the founders of the US system of government, wrote to Theodore Sedgwick of Stockbridge, Massachusetts,
Our real disease, which is democracy, the poison of which by a subdivision will only be the more concentrated in each part and consequently the more virulent.
Elbridge Gerry, another founding person of the US government, said,
The evils we experience flow from an excess of democracy.
So it should come as no surprise that the only people who could vote in the first US election in 1776 were white male landowners, people who have no interest in the interests of common folk. That's you again, isn't it? The common person doing things on the common, like a womble of Wimbledon. I don't care if you don't know what a womble is. I don't have to appeal to a broad audience. The next development was that of the secret ballot, which appeared in 1856 in two flavours in Australia. The South Australian method required putting your mark next to the candidate you liked, whereas the Victorian method, and the method anarchists prefer, involves crossing out the names of candidates you don't want, which for anarchists would be everybody on the ballot. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, said, though it can't be verified through any sources whatsoever, he said,
A man should be proud of who he votes for, and thus no ballot should be secret. If you've got nothing to hide, then you've got nothing to worry about.
That's what he said before sentencing somebody to 175 years in a supermax prison for revealing what the surprise dessert was for the troops on Wednesday. The next progression occurred in 1893, when New Zealand introduced universal suffrage. For those keeping track, we're now 2,647 years into democratic history. The term suffrage comes from the conglomeration of two words: suffer, because you have to queue for the voting booth, and rage, because even if your candidate won the vote, they don't do anything for you because you didn't contribute a hefty chunk of change to their campaign fund. Historians who maintain that the word comes from medieval Latin and means the right of voting are clearly off of their rocker and don't know what they're talking about. A cynical person, hello, might argue that the adoption of universal suffrage indicated that votes from the proletariat had become, as intended, meaningless. The expansion of suffrage and the recent and sharp contraction of it in the USA are equally meaningless, though obviously the people whose rights have been curtailed might feel a little differently. Why do the powerful, those in charge of the systems of representative democracy, allow for universal suffrage? The answer is surprisingly simple. Voting is a facade to placate the masses into believing they have some semblance of a say in the going on of things every few years, which immediately and resolutely falls apart on first examination. A majority of Americans want universal healthcare, but the one party, be it the Democrat or Republican flavor, never have such on their agenda. The real movers and shakers within representative democracy are those with money, corporations and the ultra-rich. In the next episode, we examine who has their thumb on the scales. Here's a hint, dear viewer, it isn't you. Thank you for watching. Please dislike the video and do not subscribe to my channel. Mess with the metrics, that's the kinds of things I like to do.